All right, we're going to go ahead and get started here. I want to make sure that we make good use of our time and respect everybody's time and get you out of here on time. So thank you everybody for joining us today. Looking forward to an exciting event. My name is James Green, I'm a partner at Actual Tech Media, and I'm your moderator for today's event. And presenting today, we've got Tim Woods. He's a VP of Technology Alliances at Firemon. And today we're going to be talking about GDPR, which I'm assuming you're at least somewhat familiar with. But if you're not, I know that Tim's going to cover the basics too and make sure that everybody's up to speed before we get really deep into everything we need to know about it. And as you may have seen in the registration emails that went out, this impacts more people than you might think. And if you think that it doesn't impact you, it's possible that it does. And so everybody needs to at least check it out and see if the regulation applies to them. We currently have 205 days until the GDPR regulation starts being enforced. So time is growing short and we need to make sure we're prepared. So I want to just point out a couple things to you before we get started. Just make sure that everybody has a good experience here. If you look at your GoToWebinar attendee panel, there's a questions box there. And the best way for you to up-level your experience here and make this a really valuable event is to submit any questions you have. Tim and I are going to be taking those questions as we go through the event. And so if you got a question there, it's a good chance somebody else has it too. And so pop that in and we'll try and address your question. Also, we have some time for Q&A at the end. So anything we don't get to as we're going, we'll try and address that at the end. And right before we wrap up, we do have a prize drawing. Today, we're giving away an R2-D2 app-enabled drone from Sphero. It's a really neat prize giveaway. So stick around to the end. Make sure you're around and eligible to win that. And without any further ado, I'm going to let Tim get started here. So Tim, take it away.
James, thank you very much. Am I eligible for that drone as well? I mean, that sounds pretty cool.
Unfortunately, I don't think so. I'm always hoping I'll win, but it never happens.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody to, first off, starting off to our audience today. I realize that you're doing this at the expense of something else, so I'm very appreciative of your time, and I'm very hopeful that the information we present today you'll find useful, and I look forward to your feedback afterwards and to your participation in the poll. So thank you very much for your attendance today. Just real quick, just a small note about myself. I've been at Firemon for about a little over 9 years, so seen a thing or two about a thing or two. So happy to entertain any and all questions as we go through here. Starting out with GDPR, one of the things that I love about GDPR, and I expect that we will see adopted by some of the other compliance initiatives in the future, is this concept of security, privacy by design and security by design and default, meaning that we can no longer treat security as an afterthought. When we're developing our processes and we're developing our compliance initiatives, we have to put security at the forefront of our application deployment, of the protection of our data privacy and those things. It has to be at the forefront of our thoughts. So security by design and default, it's an excellent concept, and I think it's one that you'll see adopted in the future by other kind of regulatory compliance initiatives as well. By no means is this going to be a full-on, complete cover of GDPR. There's tons of information out there about GDPR. It's very encompassing. Some of it's open to interpretation, as we'll talk about. So I would, hopefully this serves as a good primer. I'll answer some of your questions and, and set you on the right path to maybe exploring some other education aspects of GDPR as it applies to you. The GDPR is essentially a refresh of the data protection directive, and we'll talk about kind of the difference there. GDPR is a regulation versus a directive and what that really means. But there's been a lot of changes over the last 20-something years or so, since 1995 when the DPD came out. And so GDPR kind of represents a facelift to that, kind of a refresh in the face of malware and new ransomware. We hear about it all the time. Advanced persistent threats. The times have changed, and our defensive posture requirements have to have to change right along with it. The changes to the DPD happened in May of last year, actually, and we're going to talk about when it launches. But it was mainly in response to this kind of up and to the right occurrences of breaches that are taking place. I mean, we saw, if I'm trying to think here off the top of my head, Yahoo, eBay, Equifax recently. I think we're all familiar with Target. You know, one of the things that I'm interestingly following right now is cloud breaches and cloud exposures as well. You know, we saw the Dow Jones, we saw Verizon, we saw the GOP analytical things where a lot of voter, at least in the US, a lot of voter registration information was accidentally exposed. I think we all remember Chase and Sony PlayStation. So just a lot of things going on. Obviously that gave way to Drive, was part of the catalyst synergy for refreshing as it applied to the EU. Goes into effect in 2018, May 25th. And so this is a regulation. It's not a directive. So what does that mean? A directive in the EU, basically the EU countries had the ability, the 28 countries across the EU had the ability to basically kind of modify and interpret the law to kind of fit or suit their own needs. The GDPR kind of brings some harmonization into that, meaning that it equally applies to everybody, and it's not something that you can just kind of willy-nilly change. So they have to adopt it as it is and follow it as it is, and it gives more of a standardization and less room for interpretation. I was asked last time, I was talking to somebody here recently actually, and they asked, what does this mean for the UK if Brexit takes place? And my understanding and what I've been told is this will carry forward into the UK. Now there may be some modifications or some changes to GDPR, but the intent of it will hold true. So the work you're doing, I wouldn't hold off on the work you're doing if in fact you are starting on your GDPR journey. You know, that's going to be very applicable for the UK in the future as well. Controllers and processors. One of the first questions you kind of have to ask yourself, and again, I was talking to a customer here recently, and they were driving some interest inside their company on learning more about GDPR. And one of the questions I asked is, you know, for the departments within your company that are holding personally identifiable information, you know, that is owned by an EU member, you know, are they doing it in the scope of a controller or in the scope of a processor? And the distinction is the processor is really the one that GDPR treats as the principal party when it comes to responsibility, the principal party for collecting not just the information and distributing information or personally identifiable information, privacy data, but then also the consent for that privacy, for owning and holding that privacy data and managing that consent. Should somebody wish to revoke that consent, you know, I no longer want you to hold on to my information. And whether you've already delivered that to a processor, it's still the controller's responsibility to make sure that the processor, you know, faithfully deletes that information. And in fact, it's called out in one of the articles that the controller will only use processors that are providing sufficient guarantees to implement the appropriate technical and organizational measures and such. I won't read that to you, but they're held responsible that the processors are GDPR compliant also. And what happens here, because GDPR is really global in nature, meaning that just because you're not part of the EU doesn't mean if you're holding on to EU information, a private citizen of the EU, and you have personally identifiable information, then you are responsible to GDPR. Now, whether the penalty phase, we're going to talk about that here in a second, whether the penalty phase can extend to you or not, it's a little unclear, but what we do know is that the controller can be held liable for the processor's failure to comply, and they can limit business interaction as well. So it's really, again, it's incumbent upon the processor, incumbent upon the controller to ensure that the processor is also compliant in order for them to continue doing business together. The data protection officer. The data protection officer is where GDPR acknowledges the value of basically data on the ground for both the controller and the processor. This is the data protection officer has a really big role as it applies to GDPR, and that is to ensure the integrity of the personal data that the company is in receipt of, and to prevent any violation of the GDPR initiative. It's also about education, educating all the departments and what their role is as it pertains to GDPR. And the GDPR or the data protection officer also has to have expert knowledge of the data protection laws and practices as well. So it's a very key role for this individual to keep the company aligned with the GDPR initiative. And this is one of the things, should a breach take place, that the authorities, that the GDPR authorities will look at to say, you know, do you have a data protection officer assigned for GDPR or not? Going back to consent, we talked about the controller usually being the principal party who owns the responsibility for ensuring consent is gathered, and that if the individual wants to revoke that consent, that they have a clear path, a clear avenue to pursue to do that. And there's additional considerations if the individual is underage, how that consent is handled, and who can withdraw that consent. So it's something that there just has to be a well-known process. It's not something that someone should have to hunt and peck around for. The problem here gets in that's discussed in a lot of different circles, of course, is that how do I know where my information has been, you know, when you start talking about a controller and a processor, who has my information been processed to, or who has it been delivered to or transferred to? And that is something that I don't think is completely worked out yet. But again, that's why it goes back to having somebody who is centrally responsible for the information, and that's going to be the controller. Probably the biggest area of discussion centers around the breach notification requirement. And this is where in GDPR, you're required, it's got everybody up in arms, you're required to notify the authorities and your customers or your clients, the people that you have receipt of their personally identifiable information, that a breach has taken place, and to report on the extent of the breach and what was actually compromised, and what you conclude that the effect of that compromise could potentially be. 72 hours, it doesn't say 72 business hours or 72 working hours, it says 72 hours. So if it happens on a Friday, you know, how do you do that? How do you get everything together in time? You have to analyze, you know, that you have to basically document that the breach took place. Then you have to kind of run some forensics on what was actually compromised, what was the extent of the compromise, how long do you suspect the compromise has been in place or has taken place? What are we going to do? What's our posture for notifying our user-based community? What is, if I'm a processor, I have to go back to my controller to let them know, or multiple controllers to discuss that as well. But anyway, it's something, you know, time will tell, and it's going to be very interesting, again, something very interesting to follow, to see how strict the authorities are going to be around these breach notification requirements. So stay tuned. I'm sure we're going to see a ton of information on this in the press going forward. one of the things that's driving that notification concern is the penalties, the potential penalties that can be assessed against both the controllers and the processors. And that is approximately 2%, what they call 2% of your net turnover, up to 4% of annual revenue. So depending on the size of the organization, regardless of your size, that's significant. Incredibly, it's monumentally significant. As far as when we talk about putting teeth in the compliance initiative, these are some really big teeth. These are some really big, this is a really big call to action and a motivator when the penalties can be this severe. Some believe that the authorities will be more work along the lines of education in the early days. It will be, they'll be a little softer. And again, this is just kind of a hypothesis, or people that are assuming the way that it's going to work. Again, we don't know yet, but there's kind of two trains of thought. One will be geared toward the lines of education and education to the community on what should have been done, or what could have been done, or how it could have been handled better. And then the other train, the other camp, or the other train of thought is, no, someone will be made an example of. I don't want to be that company that's made an example of, to show that, hey, we're serious about this, either fall in line or else. And so that's yet to play out. We'll see how that plays out. Again, another interesting aspect of GDPR that we're all going to follow. If you're just starting out on your GDPR journey, then just put a couple of bullets here. Create an achievable plan, focus on the most immediate items. Have a process in place for reacting to a breach as well. It's interesting to me, as long as I've been doing this, how many companies really don't have a well thought out breach response plan. And so I think GDPR, where GDPR brings this into an even bigger light, is that with the 72-hour response time, you have to have a plan in place. You have to have a process plan in place on how you're going to evaluate the extent of the breach, how you're going to notify the authorities, how you're going to notify the community and your customer base. You have to, in the pressures that come immediately following a breach, you have to have a well-defined practice process plan in place for not only limiting, obviously we got to stop the bleeding first, right? And after we've done that, then we have to look at the extent of the damage. But how do we report on that? Who's responsible for what, and which pieces of that? So very, very important. And it all starts with a solid security plan, solid security management. And this is how we'll, I'll get into this a little more, and where we can help as a company. And I'll tell you a little more about Firemon, but the ability to thoroughly understand your security policy behavior across, all the different enforcement points that can exist, especially if you're a global organization or a very large enterprise organization. I mean, we could be talking about hundreds of firewalls, hundreds of firewall policies, hundreds of thousands of rules potentially, way more than what an individual human is capable of actually analyzing. And we've seen this over the last few years continue to rise. I call it the complexity gap. We call it the complexity gap here at Firemon. And essentially what we're seeing is this acceleration of the amount of rules going way up, unlike my stock portfolio, way up and to the right. And it's driven by a number of different variables. It's driven by regulatory compliance initiatives. It's driven by acquisitions and mergers. It's driven by micro-segmentation, adoption of SDN and cloud. But whatever the reason, there's definitely an incredible growth. Personally, I can speak to this from my own personal experience when having managed firewalls and been involved with firewalls and security most of my career. In the last 9 years at Firemon, when I first joined Firemon back in the day, I mean, seeing a checkpoint firewall with 800 rules on it was significant. And today, we routinely see firewalls with 10,000, 12,000, 15,000. We've seen Cisco's with 30,000, 40,000, 50,000, over 100,000 rules on a single enforcement point. So needless to say, being able to analyze something with tens of thousands of rules on it, to go through that line by line and try to understand the policy behavior is just not something without the aid of technology or automation. It's just not possible. To complicate things even further, the staffing, the resources necessary to manage these has remained somewhat static. And so, and there is an acknowledged shortage of skill sets in the security community as well. So couple those two things together, those three things together, and we can kind of see where the problem starts and the challenges start to form.
Hey, Tim, we got a couple of good questions here. So how about if I throw up a poll question real quick and we'll take a couple if that's all right with you?
That would be great. Good time.
Okay, good. All right, I'm going to launch the poll. Go ahead and answer this if you're interested in participating. We'd just like to know, as you're getting prepared for this upcoming enforcement, how's that going? Are you just getting started? Do you feel like you're most of the way there, all the way there? Tell us what's going on for you with GDPR. And while people are answering that, Tim, you mentioned the role of the what is it, chief data officer?
Data protection officer,
Data
correct?
protection officer. Is that a role that every organization who could possibly fall under this regulation needs to appoint somebody to? I mean, if it's a company of 15 people, do they need to appoint somebody to that role?
It's my understanding that it's not a hard, fast requirement depending on the size of the company. Again, it's somewhat loosely defined. It's strongly encouraged, regardless of your size, that someone has responsibility for ensuring two things. One is that you have a plan in place, and two, that you're properly educating your people on what the responsibilities, on what their personal responsibilities to GDPR are. So it's well advised. I don't think that it's hard and fast. Now, companies of a larger size, and again, open for interpretation. It's not complete. And I think these are some things. Understand, for everyone listening out there today, that GDPR is new. It's still mature, and even though it's drafted off of the Data Protection Directive, there's going to be some maturation going forward here, or some growth in it as we go forward, and some of these things will get ironed out, and I think that will be more tightly defined. But today, this is one of those things. The data protection officer is a little bit loosely defined as far as what size do I have to be, where it is a hard and fast requirement for me to have a data protection officer.
Sure, but it sounds like maybe it's a better safe than sorry sort of thing. Maybe.
Highly recommend.
Okay.
Highly recommend. Right. Yep.
Here's another great question. Ryan is saying basically, I think there's potential this applies to us, but we don't really know if some of the people that we're working with are European Union citizens. So, since I don't have this information, what happens if, what happens if we're breached and some of them are, but I never knew, basically?
If you're external, and again, we don't know how, again, I go back to how strict the authorities are going to be, the Court of Justice for the European Union, how strict they will be, and how at what level they're actually going to enforce the penalty phases. But one thing's for sure when it's related to compliance is, a lack of knowledge is not an excuse. And this is why I stress to everybody is to start doing that start looking inside today, start doing those. We'll talk in a little bit here about data impact assessments. And this is really where we have to, and we'll talk about where we have to look. We do have to identify, do we have that information? Are we doing business with people that's transferring EU? Maybe it's a business list. Maybe it's nothing more than a mailer that has somebody's email address and maybe a phone number, or an email address and a title and a name. Maybe that's the extent of the personal identifiable information. or maybe it does go. Maybe there is more metadata attached to that, or more personal identifiable information attached to that. But those are things that we have to look inside and assess for ourselves if we do in fact hold on to any of that data, because we can be held responsible. Now again, if you're external to the EU, what does that mean? Not sure. But what I do know, per what I've learned about GDPR thus far, is that the controller and or the processor can be held responsible within the EU Union, and so they can be not only penalized, but they can be forced to cease business operations with that external entity that's found to be non-compliant with GDPR.
Interesting. All right. Well, let's close the poll here and see what people are saying about how the journey is going for them. Wow. So 61% of people are saying we haven't even started yet. That could be because it doesn't apply to you, but you're just collecting some information. But if it does apply to you, 205 days until enforcement starts.
8 months.
And then, hey, 3% of people say they're totally prepared. So good on you guys. That's great. And then a lot of people in between. All right, let's keep going.
So we're going to keep going. So there are different defense strategies. Regardless, you have to adopt something, right? As a defense strategy, you need to. Usually, there's combinations of good practices to follow. I mean, again, with the people, we spend a lot of time with companies on cloud adoption and the adoption of SDN within their networks, and hybrid clouds and multi-cloud and kind of a combination between the legacy and cloud deployments. And what we're finding in the cloud arena, as we move into the cloud, there's a desire to do more kind of segmentation or to put even more controls in place. But there's a lack of visibility. We don't have the same, maybe the mature security controls that we found in the legacy implementations that we have up in the cloud. But that's growing quickly and changing very quickly. But regardless, you just have to have a good defense plan in place. There's 99 articles in GDPR. I'm only going to focus on a few of these where I think that Fireman can help, and I'm going to give some examples of this. But by far, there's 99, and I would encourage you to kind of go through the 99 articles. But equally important to the articles, there's also 173 what they call recitals. And the recitals, the understanding of the recitals is just as important as understanding the actual articles themselves, because it's the recitals that will be used by the CJEU, or the Court of Justice of the European Union, to interpret the articles, especially when it comes to breaches and ability to comply to those articles. So that's really the supporting documentation around the articles as well. So I would encourage you to look, it's all online. I believe we have a white paper I'll talk about at the very end of this that you can download from fireman.com, and we have our references in there. But again, Google's your friend there, and this stuff can be easily found on the network as well. I'm going to breeze through these. Companies must be able to provide reasonable level of data protection. What is reasonable? Again, this is one of those areas that's not tightly defined. When I think about, we'll talk about the different areas, but essentially it's holding you responsible for ensuring that you're taking kind of a best practice approach, best effort approach to securing the information. Companies must conduct data protection impact assessments. This, I think, this is a wonderful thing to do. If you're not doing these today, I'm sure for those that answered that they're already fully compliant or very aware of what a data impact information assessment looks like. There's online, the government, the EU government actually has a proposed outline as well that you can use to modify it to your own individual environments and needs. But essentially, this is where you kind of go in and assess yourself. Where are my holes? Where are my potential holes? Where are my potential areas that maybe I'm not as compliant as I need to be? Whether that's around transparency of consent, or transparency, the ability to revoke consent, or whether we just don't really know where all of the information, the privacy, the personal information is stored, and what controls we have around that. The first thing is to identify where it's at, and then so that I'm able to place the appropriate controls around it. I put this in also in Article 58 because this really talks about the power of the supervisory investigative powers, the powers that they have. Basically, if you are subject to a breach or you report that you've been breached and they come in, you essentially, this goes into what you have to expose. Here's the levels of I call it pulling back the layers of the onion, but basically you now have to open your kimono and show them everything that they ask for. So you need to have, we'll talk very briefly about some technology in place to help you conduct that as well. Very quickly, just to kind of amplify the problem, on the average, it takes 256 days to identify a malicious attack. This comes from this particular part of this statistic comes from the Ponemon Institute. Human error we see on the rise as complexity. We talk about that complexity gap. One of the things that we find in the complexity gap is as complexity kind of continues to go up, either due to unused rules. There's a lot of reasons for why complexity goes up, but we find that as complexity goes up, the propensity or the probability of human error is also going to go up. And it takes an average, Ponemon says it takes an average of 158 days to identify when human error has taken place. Of course, unless it causes an immediate impact to the business. Some attackers nowadays, some are saying that we're winning the battle, that it's not as lucrative as it once was. Some are saying it's actually more lucrative than it once was. But regardless of whether the attacks are pecuniary or financially motivated or geopolitically motivated, reputationally motivated, most of the attackers, we'll call them the nefarious individuals, bad actors, say they're in it for the money. In fact, over 70% of those interviewed by the Ponemon say they're in it for the money. I thought this was interesting. 65% of large organizations were breached. This comes from the gov.uk, and you can see these publications. The UK government publishes a cybersecurity breach survey each year, so I would solicit you to seek that out as well. The Cybersecurity Breaches Survey for 2016, they haven't produced one for 2017 yet, but really chocked full of good information. Where is all the information? This is what you got to look at. As you look across your environment, as you look across your infrastructure, you have to kind of ask yourself, where does all the information reside? And you're responsible for protecting, regardless of where it resides, whether it's on the data storage, whether it's in the cloud, at the server level, at the network level, wherever it resides, you're responsible for putting the security measures around that. So the first thing you have to do is, this goes back, and it was a great question that was asked, what if I don't know that I'm in receipt of that information? I would encourage you to try to go find out, to kind of look across the organization to say, where do we store our information? Where does our information come from? And what is it composed of? So James, I'm going to stop right there. Any other questions or polls before I get into some of the more Firemon specific things?
Sure. Yeah, let me launch another poll here. We're just curious to find out whether or not you are operating within the European Union. And while people answer that, I do have a couple more questions here. Do you know if there is a similar sort of regulation that exists in the US and Canada that would mandate some similar things?
Well, we definitely have our share of compliance regulations from FISMA to HIPAA, as in the medical field, to PCI in the financial community, ISO 27000, SOX, Sarbanes. We have an abundance of compliance initiatives. Power has their own. The state of California is one of the first to adopt, breach notification regulations, things like that. So, yeah, we definitely have some. Again, I think this is probably the most current compliance initiative, and that's why I pointed out at the beginning there, kind of security by design and default approach that they're taking. And again, I think as we see some of the other compliance, regulatory compliance initiatives revamped and updated to meet current times as well, we'll see some like adoption of that type of language. So interesting to follow. But yeah, we have plenty of compliance initiatives, that's for sure.
Yeah, agreed. And since you mentioned that, a couple of people have asked, the same way we have auditing frameworks to check compliance against, say, HIPAA or PCI or something, is there already an established framework that we can use to check against GDPR and whether we're compliant or not?
Yeah, so there's not.
Besides just,
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, it's a good question. Again, I would point back to reviewing the data protection or the kind of the data privacy investigation guidelines data impact assessments and data protection guidelines that they have published first. There's not a hard, fast report because the language in GDPR is so, I don't want to say vague, but there's a lot of room for interpretation as far as what best effort and what that really means in some of the areas. What I'm going to, and this is probably a good time to go ahead and talk about how we can help if we're ready to proceed.
All right, I'm going to close the poll here and we'll see the results. Looks like about 40% say they are, 60% are not, but just to be clear, what we were at least intending to ask here was whether you're actually operating within the EU, but that would not mean, that would not exclude you from having collected some of this information and GDPR applying to you. All right,
yeah, potentially as a processor, that's correct. Yeah. You may be in receipt of that.
All right, carry on, Tim.
So here's what I would, well, a little bit about Firemon. First of all, we are global. We have offices, we have customers all over the globe, probably across every single market vertical that you can think of. So a lot of maturation. We've been around the better part of 15 years. So a lot of deep domain expertise in the security field as well. And as we've seen the compliance initiatives grow, and when we've seen some of the security challenges that have popped up and some of the growing and security challenges, we actually put out a report each year. Also, it's called the State of the Firewall Report that I would solicit our listening audience to take a look at as well. We're in our third year of that. It's just a lot of good general information around statistic adoption of SDN and next generation firewall and IoT and things like that. So some good information there. We have offices around the globe. We're actually based in Overland Park, Kansas City, the Silicon Prairie, as I like to call it. We have a very robust technology partner ecosystem. Some that I don't have everybody on here. I just put some of the main partners that we work with. But what we typically see at the customer level is a combination of several of these. And then abroad, we see some that might not be as recognized, whether it's Hillstone or Huawei or SecUI or OnLabs. There's a lot of them out there. We support approximately 50 different, I'll say 50 different technology partner permutations today. But we have a great synergy with our technology partners as well. So chances are that you recognize probably several of them for your own networks that you're using today. As I think about how Firemon can help, Firemon focuses on greater visibility, giving you intelligent visibility into your security environment so that you have actionable data that can keep you kind of up to speed as things change and happen and make and give you a better security posture. We also are a big believer in dynamic compliance initiatives, meaning, and I'll talk about that as we go through here, but being able to automate some of those compliance tasks so that it's not relying on the human factor to ensure that we conduct those things in a consistent basis, that we allow the technology to do that for us. But I always like to say, one of the first places to start before you can start down that journey is you got to clean up what you have. You have to, and I think this is true for any compliance initiatives. This is not just not just GDPR, but before you can get compliant, I mean, you have to wrap your arms around where you're at today. Where we find some of the biggest problems take place is the lack of management in the past, and so we still have to take responsibility for that. So ensuring, so it kind of starts with cleanup, and that's what I've highlighted here in this slide. You know, you want to ensure that compensating controls are only allowing that access that is necessary to meet the needs of the business. Help identify. We want to be able to help and mitigate, you know, security vulnerabilities, identify the threats of security holes and security policies that could be exploited by hackers. You know, we're always punching holes in the firewall and allowing access, but, you know, do we ask ourselves, does that access that I just opened up, did that expose me to a known vulnerability on my network? A lot of times we don't ask that question. Or the vulnerability scan people aren't talking, group is not talking to the IT enforcement security group. Just some simple things like that I think we could correlate that would let us, that would have a good indication on our risk posture or potential exposure to risk. But too often, because of this complexity gap and the increase in complexity due to unused rules, due to redundant and to shadowed rules, you know, misconfiguration takes place, unauthorized change takes place, and we open ourselves to unacceptable risk. So being able to automate that and include substantiating documentation as a best practice is very important. I like to say that you need a prescriptive process, and I'm not going to go through this. I'd be happy to entertain kind of in more detail each of these steps, but essentially you want to get rid of the low-hanging fruit. How can I make the biggest impact in the least amount of time, making the most effective use of my resources? And that's kind of what step one kind of focuses on. Step two is looking more at usage over time. You know, what's being used, what isn't being used, when was it last used, things like that. But just having something that exposes that, giving you insight to that is really important. Most, you know, the native management tools that we have in place today just don't do this in a consistent manner. And so being able to do that is important. One of the biggest things that we run into as I look at step three here, and I apologize if that's a little bit too small for our audience to look at, so I'll ask you to squint a little bit there, but you know, is this concept of overly permissive access. And what happens here is because of the speed of business, we find ourselves being faced with this whole acceleration of DevOps, and we're able to deploy applications faster, or we're leveraging cloud now. We're actually able to deploy applications faster than we ever have. But security, unfortunately, the same security controls and the necessary security controls, you know, around those applications that protect that information transferred within those applications hasn't accelerated at the same pace. And so what happens is the poor IT security individual is many times faced with inadequate information to make a change, and they try to put in the best access rule possible to meet the needs of the business, but sometimes because they have inadequate information, they put in an overly permissive rule that allows more access than what the business needs, with the good intent, with the absolute good intent of going back and cleaning that up later and refining that when they go seek that information out. Unfortunately, because of the workload that they're faced with today and the shortage that we have and the reduction of resources that we're incurring, is that going back and cleaning that up never happens. And then we talk about continual policy monitoring and management, which gets me into my next slide. You know, once we get our arms around cleaning up our environment, we want to put a good policy process, a good policy workflow process in place that allows us to capture documentation. This, again, is going to be so important for GDPR and any compliance initiative that, you know, in addition to GDPR, that you may be held responsible to. So being able to constantly monitor for change, you know, every compliance initiative, I don't care what it is, GDPR, PCI, FISMA, HIPAA, you know, one of the things they ask right off the bat is, are you monitoring for change? Are you analyzing that change? Are you reviewing your rules on some frequency? Do you have valid business owner? Do you have a valid business justification for the access that's being provided? And can you prove it? That's the biggest thing, is can you prove it? Do you have sustaining documentation that if a QSA, if a quality security auditor comes in and picks out a rule in your firewall and says, tell me about this rule. What is this rule for? Who does it belong to? What's the business justification for this rule? Can you substantiate that? Can you give them information? I'll tell you what I see, and what I've seen over the last 10 years is every form of documentation to track policy change under the sun. I've seen spreadsheets, email, Word documents, homegrown databases. I do see ITSMs or CRM, Service Center, HPNA, ServiceNow, Remedy, Clarify, things like that being used also. But rather than it being used, what I see is the security group still using either spreadsheets and Word documents, or worse yet, email, and that information is getting manually transferred into the tracking system, the change tracking system, but it's not getting it's not done dynamically. It's not done in an integrated fashion. And as a result, it doesn't scale and it falls short. And we find ourselves with very, very large gaps of missing information as it relates to our policy documentation. And auditors will eat that up. Another thing that I like to say is actionable threat intelligence. If you don't have something to gain good insight into just actionable threat intelligence, you need to address that. Just as we looked at the volume of firewall rules rapidly growing, we also encounter a very similar scenario with the volume of security alerts and incidents, where the sheer amount exceeds our security team's capability and capacity to investigate them in a reasonable amount of time, let alone assess if they're indicators of a threat gaining a foothold within our real estate. So the requirements for investigating complex incidents outpace the capabilities and capacities of our current tools and network teams. We have a product called Immediate Insight, which is a security analytics and investigation platform for data discovery that can help enable teams to accelerate their security investigations, especially if, when we go back and we look at Article 58, whenever that investigative power is asking you to show me contextually, forensically where some of the breach information exists, then I need to be able to gain that information. And and what's unique about our solution here is we take this information, and the information can come from multiple sources. It can be disparate information, unstructured information that we put together, but you don't have to put together these you don't have to use a structured query language or some complex search customization. Instead, we leverage a natural language search, the same as you would use any number of popular web search engines today. So we essentially can help anybody become that data scientist or that business data analyst very quickly. So really interesting technology that I would solicit you to learn more about from us. We define intelligent policy automation as a way to eliminate ineffectiveness and risk. Pre-change impact analysis. This is really hard stuff right here. Being able to take a rule and assess the impact. When we talked about those policies that have 10,000, 15,000, 12,000, 40,000 rules in them, being able to take a proposed change and sandbox that change and then run your compliance assessments against it before you put it on the policy, before you implement it. Being able to do that in the context and the behavior of the policy itself is really, really hard to do. We can't do it manually. Just having custom assessments that run dynamic, that can run so that every time a change is made, we make sure that no one has violated our security posture or they've enabled a clear text protocol from the inside to the outside, or they enabled some form of zone communication from one zone container to another zone container, that we absolutely say based on our application port guide that this isn't allowed. We want to make sure that every time a change takes place, that it's going through our set of standards and it's being and it's being assessed for any type of violation of our standards. The other thing you want to do is to make sure that we did what we said we were going to do. Right at the end of a change process, we should be verifying those changes that we make to say, hey, we want to make sure nobody took some creative liberties here, and that, or that we just didn't make an honest mistake here. This was the change. Here's the way it was engineered here or designed to meet the needs of the business. This is what was approved. This is what was staged. This is what was implemented. And here's what actually took place. I call it the as-built. But I want to make sure that that as-built, kind of the post-implementation, looks like the pre-approved implementation. And we need to be able to do that in an automated fashion. And this is where we introduce policy lifecycle management. So I talked about the cleanup process. Firemon can definitely help you with that cleanup process, but we can also help you institute a full circle lifecycle management scheme, meaning that from the beginning that we look, where we fail so often is just capturing the right information. Are we capturing the right information up front? Are we identifying, number one, if the rule even exists or not? Do I need to add this rule before, or does it already exist? Too often we put in redundant or repetitive rules that already exist. The policy behavior already supports what the individual or the user or the business user is looking for there. And we also need to analyze the impact of this proposed change to our compliance initiatives, to our risk posture. Is it unacceptable? Or do we need to step back and look at remediation prior to implementing the request before approving the request? The other thing that I hear a lot as I look at item number 4 here on the list that you have in front of you is, I hear this almost weekly now, is I have my best people doing some of the most repetitive tasks. They're not doing what I hired them to do, or what I originally hired them to do. I need them working on higher level things, but they're getting caught up in some of these mundane repetitive tasks, and it's eating up their work cycles. And so is there a place there that we can automatically automate some of those things? And then at the very end, I'm going to skip through here because I want to leave a couple of minutes here for questions, and we're reaching the top of the hour. But post-implementation review, recertification, and monitoring. I want to make sure, and I'll just give you an example of some of the information that we catch as a process of our workflow. And some of the most important things here, we capture a lot of information, but one of the most important ones here that you see on this, what I'm calling this critical documentation, this critical metadata in supporting the access that's being provided, it's the stakeholder, it's the owner, it's the business unit, it's the creation date, it's when I'm going to review it again, when it was last reviewed, and probably most important to the documentation process is, do I have adequate business justification for the access that's being provided? But being able to capture that consistently as a component of the workflow process is important, not just to GDPR, but any compliance initiative that you have. So these are some of the areas, again, being able to clean up what you have, being able to institute a very flexible and dynamic compliance initiative around your policies, and then being able to institute a full lifecycle managed policy process and capture this documentation dynamically and automatically is the areas where Firemon can help. I would love to walk through with anyone out there, how we can do this. We do demonstrations of the product all the time. If you think it's a product that can help you in gaining your GDPR compliance or PCI compliance or HIPAA or FSMA or whatever it happens to be, we'd love to talk to you about it. So I'm going to stop right there, James. We have a couple of minutes left, and open it up for any additional questions.
Fantastic. While we do that, I'm going to throw up one more poll for anybody who's open to participating. After we talked about automating some of this security workflow, we're just curious how those of you that are on today are doing that. While we let people answer that, Tim, this is kind of a general GDPR question, not so much Firemon specific, but paraphrasing the question here, but what is your understanding when regulation starts becoming enforced that improvement and documenting, that we understand as much as we can understand right now about it is sufficient, or is there a hard and fast checklist that will say, if you're doing this, you're compliant, if you're doing this, you're not?
Unfortunately, it's a good question. It's a great question, and it's a question that's, you're not the only one to ask it. It's a repeated question, meaning that I hear it a lot. What are my guidelines? What are my hard and fast guidelines for making sure that I'm doing the right things to be compliant? Again, and unfortunately, there's a lot of interpretation around this area. There's not, based on your collection of information, what information you hold, there's not a hard fast rule. What I can tell you is, document the access that's being provided around that information, or where you're protecting that information, where you store that information. Understand that you're responsible for the controls on who can get in and who can get out, and who you're delivering that information to. If you're transferring that information, if you're a controller and you're transferring that information to a processor, you need to document, exactly what it is that you are transferring to that processor and what they're in receipt of. Because you, as the controller, should someone come in and want to revoke their consent, then you need to be able to go back to that processor and say, hey, you need to delete or purge this record from your system, and you need to be able to verify that. Otherwise, you can be held responsible. So you need to document that. Again, documentation here is king. I think if you can show documentation, if you can show evidentiary proof, if you can show that you're doing your due diligence to, number one, restrict access to only what is needed to meet the needs of the business, and that you're tracking the documentation of that, and you're staying on top of your processors, if you're a controller, or as a processor, that you're not keeping any information longer than what the need of the business dictates. That's the other thing. You don't want to be in receipt of a lot of information that you don't need anymore, that's outlived its business usefulness. If it's an outdated list, if it's an outdated, whatever it happens to be, purge that information, get rid of it, especially if you're a processor. So I hope that helps. I know it's not a clear-cut answer, because there's not a clear-cut answer yet today, that there's not a specific checklist that is completely consync. Again, I would go back to the data impact assessment and ask you to review that.
Great, thank you. I'm closing the poll here, and real quickly I'll share the results and then we'll wrap it up. Looks like a lot of people are at least started down this automation journey. Some yet to start, and 10% say they've automated very heavily, so that's encouraging. Let me hide this here, and I know you want to direct people to this white paper where they can learn some more, and then I'm going to do a prize giveaway, and we'll be out of here. Tim, did you want to say anything about that white paper, or should people just go to fireman.com/resources?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, James, I didn't pick up on the cue there. Absolutely, I would encourage you to download that. There's other resources out there that I would encourage you to take a look at as well. Again, if you want to, there's a simple button to request a demo. If you'd like to get a demo of our solution, or you just want to talk to either myself or any of our able-bodied engineers, sales engineers, to talk to, I would ask you to just to hit that button. We don't inundate you with a bunch of spam mail and things like that, but we'll have somebody set up a call with you, and we'll look at your particular challenges, we'll look at your particular requirements, and we'll map those to our functionality and show you where we can help. We do it all the time. We would love to help you explore, where we believe that we can bring some benefit to the challenges that you're faced with. So I'm always available myself personally. My email is right there. So if there's anybody that'd like to reach out to me directly, happy to do so. Happy to hear from you. And again, thank you for your time today. I'm very appreciative of you taking time out of your schedule to listen to us today.
And thank you so much. That was extremely enlightening, and I hope people will dig in and and learn some more from you. Before we go, I do have to do a prize giveaway here. I know some of you are hanging out waiting for that. Today's prize is an R2-D2 app-enabled drone from Sphero. Looks pretty cool. And the winner for that is Ron Morneau. Ron Morneau will be in touch with you to get you that prize delivered. Thanks everybody so much again for being on today. We really appreciate it. Have a good day.
Thanks everyone. Thank you.